Thanks everybody for tuning in. Indeed, what I'm going to present today is something completely new. So this is the first time I'm presenting it. So I'm very happy to receive some feedback. It will also be the first sort of small part of a larger project that I hope to be able to work on in the future. So as you can see, the title of this talk is Words Matter, Conceptual Engineering Meets Psycholinguistics, and the structure of the talk will be as follows. I'll first introduce what I take to be a somewhat neglected challenge for conceptual engineering projects. I call it the challenge for revisionism. And I'll argue that standard rationales for conceptual engineering don't sufficiently address this challenge. And then in the second part, I'll sketch some evidence from psycholinguistics that I take to be relevant to address this challenge. And then in the third part, I'll draw some implications of this evidence for conceptual engineering, and in particular for the challenge of revisionism. And I'll end with a brief conclusion. Okay. So let's start with some terminology. I will make use of this distinction that is, I think, widely acknowledged in the literature already between conceptual engineering in a wide sense and conceptual engineering in a broad sense. And here I stick to Sarah Sawyer's recent proposal to draw this distinction. Here's a quote from her on the slide. Conceptual engineering in the wide sense involves just any form of theorizing that involves a proposed change in linguistic practice. And this can involve many things, for example, the elimination of a term, the introduction of a new term, or the revised use of a specific term. And then contrast this with conceptual engineering in the narrow sense, which is just one way of doing conceptual engineering in the wide sense. And according to Sawyer, again, conceptual engineering in the narrow sense involves the revised use of a term. So I hope that when I take up this distinction, I can remain fairly neutral on what the ultimate objects of conceptual engineering are. As many of you know, there's this huge debate whether conceptual engineering projects actually target concepts or perhaps semantic meanings or speaker meanings or classification procedures. But I think that regardless of what you think of this question, the result will be, if it's conceptual engineering in the narrow sense, the revised use of a term, or in the broad sense, any proposal to change linguistic practice. Right? Whether this involves replacing the concept that we express by a term, or changing the semantic meaning, or using a different speaker meaning, doesn't matter so much. Okay, one thing I'd like to point out is that conceptual engineering in the narrow sense involves, I think, two proposals that I was looking at it in separation. The first is the proposal to use a certain category, or to use a certain concept or a speaker meaning or what have you, instead of others. And then the second proposal that sort of distinguishes conceptual engineering in the narrow sense from other ways of doing conceptual engineering is the proposal to use a particular pre-existing term or word to refer to this category. And here are just two proposals that are often cited in the literature that exhibit this kind of structure. There's the Clark and Sharma's work on the notion of belief, and also on the extended mind in general. And one thing they claim in this paper is that there's a useful category, namely a category that comprises roughly internally as well as externally stored information that are easily accessible to cognizers, and that can thus be used in all sorts of ways. And there's also a second proposal in this paper, namely that we should use the pre-existing term belief to denote this concept or category. Something similar goes on in the recent work of Kate Mann. She proposes a useful category roughly as follows: hostile forces that tend to be faced by girls and women because they are girls and women, and that serve to police and enforce a patriarchal order. And then there's also a terminological proposal. We should use the pre-existing term misogyny to talk about this concept or category. Okay, now you can call revisionism the doctrine that sometimes we should pursue conceptual engineering in the narrow sense. Sometimes we should use a pre-existing term to talk about a newly identified or revised category, rather than, for example, introduce a new term to talk about it. And I think there's an obvious question about this. Why should we? Why should we sometimes use a pre-existing term to talk about something new? Why shouldn't we just always introduce a new term when we've identified a new phenomenon or a new category? And I think that answering this, I call it the revisionist challenge, or the challenge for revisionism, it's important for a number of reasons. So one is just that well, the doctrine of revisionism, and therefore the whole project of conceptual engineering in the narrow sense depends on it. If there were no good reason to prefer conceptual engineering in the narrow sense over other forms of conceptual engineering, then revisionism would be off the table. And I think this kind of challenge gets strengthened if you consider the obvious disadvantages that using a pre-existing term to refer to a new category or to express a new concept has. For example, it has been argued in the literature already that using a term in a new way can cause miscommunication or even verbal disputes. It gives rise to some sort of change of topic objection. Or the implementation challenge. How can we make it the case that a large number of people now use a pre-existing term to talk about something new? Or perhaps even more dramatically, how can we change a standing semantic meaning of a term? And to some extent, those problems, I think, are faced by revisionists in more dramatic ways than by people who engage in other sorts of conceptual engineering. And also notice that I think it is curious that it seems to be implicitly assumed in a lot of the recent literature about conceptual engineering that there is a good answer to the revisionist challenge, right? Because there is this, as I said already, this huge debate about implementation, about Strawson challenge. And if I'm right, that those challenges are sort of dependent on the revisionist picture, then it seems to be presupposed in a lot of the recent work that revisionism is a good idea. Okay, and with this in the background, I think it's interesting to see that many of the most cited rationales for doing conceptual engineering actually don't speak to the revisionist challenge. They don't make a case that we should sometimes keep a pre-existing term when we do conceptual engineering. So one of those more often cited rationales is a rationale from Deficient Concept. It's been advocated by Kevin, but also by others. Herman Kaplan also mentions it in the book, and it goes roughly as follows. First, there's an observation that many of our concepts are deficient in some sort of way, epistemically, perhaps semantically, because they're inconsistent or something of the sort, or morally. And then, of course, it seems to be important to use non-deficient concepts, not only in theoretical enterprises, but in many other enterprises as well. And from this, it seems to follow that we should critically assess and, if necessary, repair or replace our concepts. Now, what does this rationale have to say with respect to the revisionist challenge? I think not much. This rationale is just silent on which terms we should use to express a repaired concept or a replaced concept. And so in this sense, the rationale might do a good job at motivating conceptual engineering in the wide sense, but it does not motivate conceptual engineering in the narrow sense. And therefore, it does not solve the revisionist challenge. I think basically the same can be said about Kaplan's master argument. So he gives a more elaborated version of this argument in his recent contribution to the volume. But here I go with a rather condensed version because I think that's enough. The first premise of this argument says we have no good reason to think that the meanings of our terms are as good as possible or as good as they should be. Those differences don't matter much for these purposes. And then the second premise says that, again, when we speak, think, and theorize, it's important to make sure that our words have as good meanings as possible or as good as they could be. And then it seems to follow from this that we should critically assess and, if necessary, improve the meaning of our words. Now, you might think that this argument does a better job at addressing the challenge for revisionism because it speaks of words and not of concepts, right? But still, I think that the master argument doesn't really show that it's important that those particular words that we are currently using have as good meanings as possible. It just shows that whichever words those may be, we should make sure that the words we end up using have good meanings or as good meanings as possible. So it doesn't give you any reason to make sure that those particular words that we are already using are being ameliorated. So again, I think for this reason, the master argument only motivates conceptual engineering in the wide sense, but it does not give any particular reason to engage in conceptual engineering in the narrow sense. So I think one perhaps bold general lesson we can draw from this is that concepts and semantics are the wrong locus to find a good answer to the revisionist challenge. And if that's the case, then where else can we look? So some suggestions have been made in the literature. For example, Sally Haslanger speaks of associations. She says associations might be an important factor here. Here's a quote from one of her recent papers. Let me make sure I can read it. She says, I've suggested that there are times when ordinary terms have a tight association with a particular subject matter, for example, water with beverages that can, rather than chemicals. And because this tight association can be hard to break, it can be strategically useful to keep using a pre-existing term. But how we proceed in any particular case will depend on the history, the politics, and the goals at issue. Now, Hermann Capellen has made a similar proposal. He uses the term of lexical effects in this context, and here's a quote from him. He says the lexical item itself can have cognitive and non-cognitive effects on us that we might want to preserve. Many words have a massive effect in social, political, legal, medical, and interpersonal contexts. We have no reason to think theoretical contexts are immune to these kinds of effects. And then this is crucial. In cases where preservation of lexical effects are important, amelioration will involve changing the meaning of the current word rather than introducing a new word. I think lexical effects are ubiquitous and of enormous importance to communication. They are poorly understood and under-investigated. So part of what I want to do in what follows is to sort of advance on this idea of lexical effects or of those associations. And to do that, I'll turn to some evidence from psycholinguistics. So if you consider the possible impact that findings from psycholinguistics might have on conceptual engineering projects, I think it's useful to separate two sorts of kinds of effects that you might study here. The first kind of effect is what I call specific effects. Those amount to the associations, or as Capellen says, lexical effects that are triggered by particular linguistic items. And psycholinguistics have certain established methods to study those effects. They frequently make use of free association tasks where people are given a word and then they are asked to basically list the first things that come to their mind when they hear that word. There are also priming tasks where you can see how one term primes you for another, and ERP studies as well. And just to give you a brief example of how such research might look like, there is this huge database called the Southern Florida Free Association Norms. Here's the link also on the slide. Perhaps I can post it in the chat later on as well. And one thing you will find on this website is something like this. For many, many words of English, you will find tables that roughly look like this. I've just brought the one for the term woman. And then you can see all the terms that are being strongly associated with the word woman. And they are ordered by the strengths of association. And I think just looking at those or clicking through this database is very interesting. And in some cases, it reveals some, well, interesting and rather disturbing features already, such as the association of adultery, compassion, emotional, and waitress with the term woman. So one thing I want to say is that conceptual engineering or people who are engaged in conceptual engineering should look at those databases because they give you interesting insight. But this said, what I will do in the rest of this talk is something different. I will rather look at certain general effects that do not pertain to particular lexical items, but things like word learning and word processing biases. So there's a large literature in psycholinguistics. I'm just sort of diving into this literature slowly because I don't have a background in psychology. But some biases that are being studied in this area are things like whole object biases, taxonomy biases, mutual exclusivity bias, shape bias, and noun bias. And there are also important word processing biases, including the noun kind bias. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. There are also essentializing effects from generics. I guess those have reached the philosophical literature to a large extent already. And more recently, Kate Ritchie has also, and I think in joint work with Josh Knope, has argued that there are also essentializing effects just from nouns, not just from generics. And there are certain embodiment effects that are also being discussed here. And what I want to do in the rest of this talk is to pick two of such biases, namely the mutual exclusivity bias and the noun kind bias, and argue that taking into account those biases has some important effects on how we should do conceptual engineering. Okay, so let's start with the noun kind bias. I think it is a fairly well-studied phenomenon that people distinguish between what they take to be mere categories and genuine kinds. And by mere categories, I mean things like all the philosophers who are present at this online conference, or tables that are missing a leg, or people who are 6 feet tall, right? All these are categories. But these categories are not kinds. Examples of kinds include tigers, water, women, and many, many more. And people have already investigated what kind of features people associate with kind representations, or which features are part of kind representations. And here's a perhaps incomplete list of the things they have found. They found that kind representations are taken to be particularly cohesive. They are taken to have, or kinds are taken to have a larger inductive potential than mere categories. Kinds are taken to be informative. If I say of something that it belongs to a kind, I'm saying something more informative than if I say that it merely belongs to some category. Kinds are also taken to have relatively stable membership. If you belong to a kind, it's not so easy to change that, basically. And kinds are taken to figure in certain forms of explanation, in particular important explanations. Okay, there are a couple of hypotheses on the market. What kind of accounts for the distinction between mere category representations and kind representations? I think one hypothesis is that it's a mere difference in content. So according to this hypothesis, kind representations include, whereas mere category representations lack information about cohesiveness, inductive potential, and so on. Another hypothesis that has recently been defended by Arché and Nope is that the difference is not just a difference in content, but also a difference in format. So according to this hypothesis, people have 2 kinds of representations for kind categories. One about just the collection of individuals, basically the category, but they also have a representation about the kind itself. And this allows them to make certain generalizations of the kind itself, and also to speak of the kind, rather than just of those individuals that are part of the category. But which of these hypotheses is true won't really matter for the rest of this talk. What will matter more is I think a fairly by now established relation between the use of noun phrases and kind representations. So one thing that I think is forcefully argued by Arché and Nope in their recent paper is that categories that are picked out by nouns instead of certain longer phrases are more likely to be seen as constituting kinds and therefore thereby to serve as an inductive basis. So here's just some of the empirical findings that are taken to support this claim. One is that when a given category is picked out by a noun instead of a certain longer phrase, then people are more likely to describe this category as a kind. Also, children are more inclined to see 2 objects as similar when they are described with identical nouns rather than with identical adjectives. And preferences and traits that are being described with nouns are seen as more persistent and stable than those that are being described with adjectives. Okay, so that is it for the noun kind bias. The important sort of take-home message is that there is a connection between simple noun phrases and representing the thing that is denoted by this noun phrase as a kind. Now I'll turn to the mutual exclusivity bias. This bias says something like this. People tend to think that newly introduced words have meanings that don't overlap with the meanings of words they already know. And this kind of phenomenon has been studied, I think, or studies about this phenomenon go back at least to the 80s. A lot of the relevant work has been done with children, and it has been found that if children are presented with familiar and unfamiliar objects, and then they are being asked to pass and then just insert some unfamiliar word, then they tend to pass the unfamiliar object rather than the object for which they already have a name. It has also been shown that the mutual exclusivity bias holds for verbs as well, not just for noun phrases. And it has been shown that adults too exhibit the mutual exclusivity bias. for example, when they study a foreign language, where they don't know all the words already. Well, one thing that is, of course, important to note is that the mutual exclusivity bias can be suspended. And some factors that have been mentioned in the literature are, for example, when labels differ in frame of reference or hierarchical level or language. So I mean, if it were impossible to suspend the mutual exclusivity bias, then you could never learn synonyms, and you could never learn sort of hierarchical ordered meanings. Okay, again, there's some debate about what is the nature of the mutual exclusivity bias. This won't matter so much for the rest of this talk, but just to mention it briefly, as according to some hypotheses, the mutual exclusivity bias is just a specific lexical phenomenon about how words work. According to another hypothesis, it is a more general principle of learning, and with language just being one instance of this general principle. And according to another hypothesis, it is sort of a derivative of a broader theory of mind that people have. But again, this won't matter for the rest of this talk. Okay, what I want to do now is to use these biases and think about the implications that they might have for conceptual engineering projects. So suppose you have a conceptual engineering project with the following features. There's a category C1, and this category is currently being picked out by some term or some word W. Now, you have reason to believe that there's another category, category C2, that is, whereas the category C1 is not a genuine kind. And that for this reason, this category is more cohesive, has more inductive potential. We should use it in our explanations and so on. I think that this features hold of most conceptual engineering projects. And now further suppose that the relation between the two categories exhibits either of those two forms. So either the category C1 is sort of a proper subset of the category C2, or at least the two categories overlap to a significant extent. Now we can look at the options that you have when you make the terminological choice about how to speak of category C2. So one option is to do conceptual engineering in the wide sense, introduce a new term for those particulars that are part of the category C2, but not part of the category C1. Another option is to simply introduce a new term for the category C2 and advocate the use of this new term. Another option is to introduce a new term for the category C2, while also eliminating the term that we already have to talk about category C1. And now the last option is to do conceptual engineering in the narrow sense, to continue using the word W to now refer to category C2 instead of category C1. So which of these options is the best? Consider first the option A. If you just introduce a new term to talk about those things that are part of the category C2 but not part of the category C1, then the noun kind bias will trick people into continuing to treat the category C1 as a kind. There's still a noun in place to talk about this kind. Also, the noun kind bias tells us that in this case, people will treat the category C2, which consists of those members of C2 that are not members of C1, as a kind, because you introduced a word for that. And that is also bad, because according to your proposal, this category does not pick out a genuine kind. And also people are not giving any reason to treat the category C2 as a kind, which is something you want in your conceptual engineering projects. So in light of this, the option A seems to be a bad option. Now option B is slightly better, but still bad, I'll argue. Now if you introduce a new term to talk about category C2, the noun kind bias tells us that people are likely to treat this category C2 as a kind, which is something you want. But the noun kind bias also tells us that people will be likely to continue treating the category C1 as a kind, because you've not eliminated the word that is used to refer to this category, which goes against the conceptual engineering proposal. And also the mutual exclusivity bias tells us that in this case, people are likely to think that the two categories C1 and C2 do not overlap, which is again an unwanted effect of this terminology, because those two categories do overlap, or one is even a proper subset of the other one. Now things get a little bit better again if you consider option C, to introduce a new term to talk about category C2 while also eliminating the term that is being used to talk about category C1. But still you get the problem that according to the mutual exclusivity bias, people will think that C1 and C2 do not overlap, whereas in fact they do. And because of this, I think, option D turns out to be the best option in such cases, because you get neither of these problems, but you get all the right cognitive effects. If you continue using the word W, but you use it now to refer to the category C2 instead of C1, people are likely to treat the category C2 as a kind. They are no longer given any reason to treat category C1 as a kind, and they are not giving any reason to think that those categories don't overlap. So if you want the Condorcet winner of this contest is option D. Option D is the option that wins against all other options. And one preliminary conclusion we can draw from this is that for conceptual engineering projects that involve category extensions or category shifts, you get the most conducive cognitive effects by retaining the original terminology. Okay. Now things look a little bit different if you have a conceptual engineering project with the following setting. Again, there's a category C1 that is currently being picked out by some word W. And again, you have reason to believe that another category, C2, is a genuine kind and that C1 is not a genuine kind. But now the relation between those two categories is as follows. They don't overlap. Again, we can look at the options. I'll make this a little bit quicker now. You can now introduce a new term for the category C2. You can also introduce a new term while also eliminating the old one. Or you can do conceptual engineering in the narrow sense, use a pre-existing term to talk about the new category. So with the option, B, we again have this problem that people are likely to continue treating category C1 as a kind. And this is bad, just as in the other example. With option C, things look better. People are likely to now treat category C2 as a kind. And according to the mutual exclusivity bias, people are likely to think that the two categories do not overlap, which now is a good thing because they don't actually overlap. And people are also no longer given reason to treat category C2 as a kind because you've eliminated the term. Sorry, that should be C1 on the slide, right? The third point should read, people are no longer given reason to treat category C1 as a kind. And now in this setting, option C looks better than option D, because in option D, you also get those two first mentioned positive effects. But now in this option, people are not giving any reason to think that the two categories do not overlap. And this is something that they should think because they do not overlap. So if the setting is, as I described here, the two categories are not overlapping to any extent, then the Condorcet winner is option C. And we can draw from this the conclusion that conceptual engineering projects that involve category replacements rather than shifts or extensions, for those projects you get the most conducive cognitive effects by introducing a new word while eliminating the use of the old one. And now this has been very sort of abstract, and I focus on the structure rather than given any examples. So before concluding, I'd like to apply this framework to some example, and I'll refer back to the Clark and Sharma's proposal about belief. So I think this is a classic example of a category extension project, right? There is this category C1, which consists roughly of information that is stored in a subject's memory. And then they talk about this new category, this wider category, which consists of just any kind of easily accessible information, be that stored in memory or written down in your notebook or in your computer or where else. And so it makes sense to think that C1 is sort of a proper subset of the larger category, C2. And they also argue that the difference between beliefs that are being, for example, stored in your notebook and beliefs that are stored in your memory, that those differences are shallow and that they don't really matter. And for that reason, they argue that the larger category C2 is more akin to a natural kind. Now, if you make the following, I think, fairly reasonable assumptions about the Clark and Sharma's case, we can get a clear answer about what is the best terminology. And the assumptions I'm making here is that the terminology they use should be chosen in such a way that it is most effective to achieve certain cognitive effects in people. For example, the effect that people treat the category C2 as a kind, that they stop treating the category C1 as a kind, and that they are not given any reason to think that those categories do not overlap. And if these assumptions hold, then we get the result that they made a good terminological choice. It is good to retain the word belief to talk about this larger category. Okay, now I'll just quickly wrap up, and I'll do so by first pointing out certain limits of this argument. For example, the argument makes certain assumptions about the goals of the conceptual engineering projects. The argument wouldn't go through, for example, in the Clark and Sharma's case, if I didn't describe certain goals about the desired effects of the terminological choices. Another thing is that, of course, the noun kind bias and the mutual exclusivity biases are precisely that. They are biases, they are not necessities. And as such, they might be strong, but they can still be suspended or overridden by other features. And I hope this became clear. I think a full treatment of terminological choices should take other evidence into account as well. For example, the specific lexical effects or associations that are elicited by certain terms that are under consideration, not just by those larger processing and learning biases. Still, I think we get here something like at least the beginning of an answer to the challenge for revisionism. One step in my argument was that words have cognitive effects that go beyond semantics. It seems to matter what meaning or concept gets paired with what linguistic item, because the linguistic item itself has certain cognitive effects already. And it turned out that for conceptual engineering projects that involve category extensions or shifts, these effects support revising the meaning or the concept that is expressed by a pre-existing term rather than the introduction of a new one. But for category replacement project, it turned out that these effects rather support introducing new words and perhaps also eliminating the old one. And lastly, I think that would-be conceptual engineers should pay attention to these kinds of effects, sort of broaden the horizon to go into psycholinguistics and linguistics and other sort of relevant empirical evidence to inform their terminological choices. And that's it. Thanks.